I've joined Paula Doyle in her studio to talk about some quilts. Now these days, Paula, we do a lot of quilts, both you and I, by machine.
Absolutely.
But I was very excited when I started my quilt shop that we did American hand piecing. And you have a lot of quilts you're going to show us because you'd like to share that with us again.
Well, hand
People have
piecing
forgotten.
was something that I did right at the beginning. I didn't have a machine, and I did things by hand. And so the very first big quilt that I did was a sampler quilt, and all of the blocks are pieced by hand and quilted by hand.
And the difference is that when I started patchwork, we knew about hexagons and English paper piecing, but your American hand piecing was quite a revelation.
No, you don't need any papers
No
for it
papers.
at all.
Thought this was great news.
And it's a running stitch.
I know, and so portable.
Very portable. I usually have a Ziploc bag with the block I'm working on, and I take it with me everywhere I go, so I always have something to do when there's something boring on TV.
And I think it's got forgotten in the mists of time with all this excitement about how quickly we can do things.
Yes,
forgotten
absolutely.
That the traditional stuff is still acceptable.
It's still around and
Absolutely.
still has a place in modern day life.
Oh, I think so, very much so.
Well, it's slow stitching, and it
Yeah.
gives you a chance to reflect on life. It's better than therapy and a lot cheaper.
Well, I think that particularly about our industry completely. But tell me about the quilt that's in front of us.
The quilt in front of us is the very first quilt that I pieced by hand and quilted by hand. It's a sampler quilt that I made for my husband's grandmother. If I had to do it all over again, I probably would have chosen slightly different fabrics and maybe more fabrics, but you always learn.
I was going to say, I think all of us say that about our first quilts.
Absolutely.
If we did
Absolutely.
it again.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So the nice
lovely.
thing about the sampler quilt was that I learned all the different types of hand
Sure.
piecing, curved piecing, inset piecing, partial piecing, a bit of applique,
Yep.
all doing one quilt. And then I learned how to do the quilting and the binding as well. So it was a perfect introduction to...
And to quilting.
Yes.
No English paper piecing.
There is some English paper piecing, yes.
Hidden on the other side. All right,
Probably hidden on the other side,
We'll
but yes.
we'll move over that.
Here's some English paper
look.
piecing.
Here's some.
This is a subsequent sampler quilt that I did.
Very different fabrics.
And again, I have some threads as well.
Yeah, well, that's
but
right.
it's
That's
it was something that I did with scraps from another quilt that was sort of autumn themed. And so it's very different colors, but the same principle.
Yeah.
I had the blocks on the go, and when I had enough blocks, I put them together.
Put it
into a
together
quilt
with
top.
sashing and then half square
Yep,
triangles.
Absolutely.
Okay. And here's another scrap quilt.
This is another scrap quilt. It's a pattern called Jewel Box.
Okay.
And again, here it was just the same block over and over. This is the block right here, and you can see it's the same exact block here. And they were just placed together without any sashing and without any variation.
And then you get the secondary patterns happening, don't you? Because there's a
Absolutely.
lovely chain across here, one
exactly,
of my favorites.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
very good, and this one was actually a friendship quilt. Some of my friends made blocks for me, so we got to choose which block we wanted to have made, and a lot of people gave me blocks, and I put them all together and made a quilt.
And this is definitely all done by hand.
All done by
I'm only
hand.
challenging you because I made one of these, but it was strip piece the Eleanor
Yes.
Burns way. So
Absolutely, and it is a lot of these simpler quilt patterns are very easy to access by machine. Very easy to transfer.
Well, the rotary cutter made a difference,
Absolutely,
didn't it? That
it
was
sure
the,
did.
that was
It sure did.
That did. But I think all of this being done by hand is just it's lovely to be reminded.
Well, this is where hand piecing starts to come in a bit to its own. This is a variation of the Drunkard's Path pattern called Fool's Puzzle, and with the curved piecing. That's just a little bit more challenging to do by machine.
It certainly is, and this scale. Yes, it is.
And so this is where sometimes hand piecing wins over machine piecing, depending on what you're making and what type of blocks you're piecing.
Now, talking about that, I know you've got a quilt on the go at the moment, and it's in a frame,
Yes.
and that's particularly true of that pattern.
Yes, it is, because it's a simple compass shape called a hummingbird. It's only got 4 points.
Okay.
And it's connected by irregular octagons, which are all inset piece in diagonal rows.
I'm glazing over where my machine's concerned.
Exactly, because the minute you talk inset piecing and
Yeah,
you know,
okay.
by machine, it
Yeah.
gets just that bit too complicated to do. So, and that is a pattern a reproduction of a quilt that I made from my grandmother's scrap basket. When my grandmother died, she left a scrap basket which came eventually to me, and there were these cut out compass shapes, which I found out later were called hummingbirds.
Okay, so
And I pieced it into a quilt and gave it to my father, whose mother it was. He had it until Hurricane Ike in Galveston a few years ago, at which point in time everything got lost. So I'm in the process of reproducing that fabric with, reproducing that quilt with 1930s fabrics.
oh my goodness, and hand quilting it, because I've seen
Absolutely.
it there.
Well, the
How
original
wonderful.
quilt was made with feed sacks.
Okay.
The original hummingbirds that my
Right.
grandmother had been made with feed sacks.
Oh, and feed sacks were surprisingly colourful, weren't they?
The feed sacks were colorful on purpose. In the 1930s, they were printed onto the cloth bags in which people bought their goods. So if you went to buy flour or sugar or anything like that, it would have come in a cloth bag. And in the 1930s, during the Depression, it was difficult to get clothing. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, came up with the suggestion that the feed bags be printed with jolly prints. And that was made possible by the fact that aniline dyes were then plentiful. Okay. And so there was these beautiful pastel conversational prints being printed on the feed sacks. And you basically got 2 large feed sacks after they were empty, and took them apart, and that 2 of them would make you a simple shift dress, and 2 of the smaller feed sacks would make you a pair of knickers.
Well, I never. Well, I never. And this is the final quilt we've got in front of us, so tell me about this.
Well, this is the first quilt where I designed the pattern myself, and so it's the first time that I hand pieced it and hand quilted it, because that's all I knew at the time.
These are tiny, Paula.
Yes,
These
and there's
are tiny.
lots of little inset piecing in there.
You're right. You're right.
So
Amazing.
it's called Home is Where the Heart Is, and I designed it and made it after we had moved 8 times in 7 years early in our marriage.
Oh my goodness.
So I guess I needed some therapy, so I got it out in a quilt.
Well, quilts, I think, make all the difference between a house and a home. And American hand piecing, I know, is going to be something that everyone is really going to want to take up. And I'm very excited that you're going to do a series for us. So
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.